I became a CFI in 2002, and I did it because in 1999 and 2000, I was taking an emergency maneuver training and spin training course at Santa Paula Airport with Rich Stoll. I never had any intention of becoming an aerobatic pilot, and I never had any intention of becoming an air show pilot or a world record breaker. But after taking that training, I realized that every pilot who doesn't take that training is missing out on something very important in their tool bag of flight skills. So I became a CFI only to teach that training. And I'm proud to say in over 20 years of being a CFI, I have never made a new pilot, but I've made a lot of, and if you know me, you'll know why, but because I don't have a lot of patience for it. But I have made a lot of pilots much safer pilots and introduced a lot of people to the drug of aerobatics, which if you've never been upside down in an airplane, even in a brief aileron roll, it's better than heroin. I haven't tried it, but people tell me it's better than heroin. So anyway, that's who I am. So that's why I'm qualified to come here and talk to you today. So why this topic? I'm going to talk about 5 undertaught topics. I wrote an article about this that was in the November-December issue of Mentor magazine, about 5, and notice they're not listed there. So I want it to be a surprise if you haven't read that as we roll through these. I promise they'll be a lot of fun, very controversial, and I can't believe the hate mail I get when I talk about things like slips. Amazing. Or maybe that's just me and my personality. But in the training I've done, where I teach mostly unusual attitude training, spin training, and get into some basic aerobatics, I've noticed that even most of my students are mid to high time pilots. And I've noticed they come with several shortfalls in their training. Use of rudder, amazing, right? That high time pilots can't use the rudder effectively. One of the techniques I like to use when I train people in a decathlon is on our first flight out, where we're just going to work on airmanship and stalls. I cover up the airspeed indicator and the ball, which freaks people out. Doesn't freak me out. I'm in the back seat. I'm not going to see anything bad happen. Their head's in the way. But it freaks pilots out. Well, how are we going to know when to take off if we can't see the airspeed indicator? Maybe we can feel it in the airplane. Maybe you'll just know. How do we know how high to pull the nose up into the proper climb attitude if we can't see the airspeed indicator? Well, we're going to learn how to learn that. And I'll tell you the secret. It's super easy. If you've flown an airplane long enough and your climb out speed is, let's say, 80 miles an hour like it is in a decathlon, how many years, how many hours have you spent looking over the nose and looking at how high the nose is above the horizon? Probably a lot. You're telling me you can't, if you've got some time in that airplane, you can't simply pull the nose up to that height above the horizon without looking at an airspeed indicator, right? That's the skill you should be able to develop, and that's why we cover up the airspeed indicator. Now, what about the ball? People, why are we covering the ball? We're going to cause a spin. Well, I hope we cause a lot of spins because that's what you're here to learn, but I promise you're not going to cause a spin because you can't see the ball. So we're climbing out and we're doing right rudder, and they always say, well, how do I know how much right rudder to use when I'm climbing out if I can't see the ball? Well, guess what? I'm going to show you. So we take off and climb out, and at about 1,000 feet, I tell them, take your feet off the rudder pedals. Oh, what? We're climbing. Right, take your feet off the rudder pedals, and of course we all know the plane is simply going to yaw to the left. And I say, where are you looking? Well, I go, well, over the nose. Why don't you look down the side of the airplane? I go, really? Yeah, how often do you look out the side window? They go, huh. How often do student pilots or pilots look out the side windows? They probably never turn their head. I've noticed that a lot. Never turn their head and look out the sides. Then I'll say, how often do you look at the wingtip while you're climbing to notice the angle of the wingtip to the horizon? They go, is that something I should be looking at? Well, yeah, it is. You should know what that looks like. What does that look like when you're climbing? What does that look like when you're in level flight? What does that look like when you're in a descent flight? So anyway, we're climbing, have them take their feet off the rudder pedals, and they notice there's a lot of real estate disappearing under the left side of the airplane because it's yawing to the left. And I just say, now add in enough right rudder to make that stop. And they do it. I go, now lift the little rubber cover on the ball. Where is? They go, oh my God, it's in the middle. There you go. It's that simple. Now, what do you feel in the airplane, right? What does your butt feel, right? How do you feel the pressure in your butt? How do you translate that into how much rudder pedal you need? And then after that, it's over. The not seeing the ball is a non-event at that point. So I've noticed this is a big shortfall. I've had multi-thousand-hour pilots who fly, you know, fairly high-performance airplanes who've not figured out how to use a rudder without looking at the ball. That's a bit, now for those of us who fly aerobatics or gliders, this is like second nature. So those are the kind of skills I think we need to improve on, and where this presentation comes from. All right, so a couple things in flying, right? We have a lot of irrational fear in flying. Well, I'm afraid of, well, a lot of people are afraid of spiders and snakes. You know, snakes on a plane, everybody knows why that's a problem. I wanted to throw some actual lines in from the movie, but apparently using all the words that a certain actor in that movie likes to use a lot was not appropriate for any audience, so I didn't. I asked Beth, my handler from NAFI, can I use those things that Samuel Johnson? She says, no, do not. Do not. Okay. But people are afraid of flying. Okay, they become pilots, they become unafraid of flying, great. But a lot of pilots are afraid of unusual attitudes. Now, I don't know what your definition of an unusual attitude is, but I don't have one because I like fly aerobatics. So to me, all attitudes are usual. In fact, to me, it's unusual to not be upside down or at an extreme angle of bank or fly along at knife edge or go straight up. Or how many people here have ever seen a window in front of them with nothing but the ground? Yeah, happens, right? Happens by accident, happens on purpose. A lot of fun when it happens on purpose. It's amazing when people see it for the first time because they become fixated on it and fly towards it for like what are you doing up there? Are you just enamored by the view of the ground and can't look in front of you? They go, yeah, kind of. So you have to be aware of that. That's ground rush, we call that. But anyway, people have irrational fears of crosswind landings. Maybe it's not irrational. But there are ways to teach it and do it. I'm going to show a lot of my presentation today when I finally shut up because you're tired of hearing me talk. I've got a lot of videos to show you with some of these techniques, which will be a lot of fun. And then we'll talk about them. We have a lot of myths in aviation, don't we? Like the Bermuda Triangle eats airplanes and they're transported to some weird place. Myth. But one of the big myths I hear a lot is spins can just happen. So let me ask the room. How many of you have ever been flying along in your airplane and the plane suddenly decided all by itself to stall and spin? Not even one person's going to put their hand up for that one? Like, it doesn't happen. Now, what are you doing when the airplane stalls typically? Anybody? Anybody ever do anything to make an airplane stall? Right, you're pulling back. That's how airplanes stall. I asked Beth, we did a blog. I said, Beth, what are you doing when airplanes stall? You know what she said? Yeah, pulling back. So that's what makes airplanes stall. And who pulls back the stick or the yoke? What's the pilot? So we know that on purpose when we teach stalls and spins. But what about in landing or traffic pattern accidents, like the infamous stall spin accident, which I think isn't so much of a spin, it's more of a spiral. That's another long discussion we can have. Pilots are inadvertently adding back pressure when they shouldn't. Right? So it's the pilot causing it to happen. So people have this irrational fear of stalling and spinning when it's something completely in their control. And what about fallacies? It's kind of one of my favorite. I love the flat earthers. They're my favorite group of people. I found a quote online from Shaquille O'Neal. He gave in an online interview where he actually said, and I wrote the quote right in there. I live in Florida. I go to California. When I drive, which I enjoy doing, because he's a big guy, he probably doesn't fit in small airplanes well. It doesn't feel like I'm going up and down over the curvature of the earth. Shaquille O'Neal said that. So when people like Shaquille O'Neal say those things, people go, that's it. The earth must really be flat. I believe it now. So a lot of that in aviation. And one of my missions in life has always been trying to dispel that. And notice I wrote up there that cross-controlled slipping or stalling while slipping, where you've got rudder in while you're stalling, does not cause spins. And I love the nasty grams I get. I hope I get some nasty grams from this audience today. But just because you stall with the rudder in doesn't automatically mean you spin. There are times when it will, but in a slip, it doesn't. So I have a video, I'm going to show that. All right, next. So first myth, or first under-taught topic. Cross-controlled slipping stalls cause a spin due to rudder deflection.
Something else I like to show people is what happens when you stall in a slip, so a cross-controlled stall. So what if you're slipping because you're needing to get down on the runway and you accidentally pull back too hard and stall? Shouldn't be a big deal. You simply look at the horizon, unload the yoke, which lets the wing fly again, and install the airplane and keep going. So let's do a little demo. We'll get down to a pattern speed. We'll pretend we're doing a forward slip towards the runway. So I put in my slip. I'm going to go right wing down, pull left rudder. Now, power out. I'm in my slip. And I'm just going to gently bring it up to the stall. There's that goat again. Up. Yoke's back. Really nothing happens. Little bit of a stall buffet, not a big deal. Let's do it the other direction. I'm slipping. I've got full right rudder in. I start pulling back too hard. I get that goat yelling in my ear. There's the buffet. Really nothing happens. Very docile and gentle. So again, something to go out and practice. Do it with your instructor if you're not comfortable doing this by yourself, but know what happens if you pull too hard when you're slipping the airplane. Slipping is a very important skill. Forward slips, turning slips, you should be totally comfortable.
Okay, so let's talk about it for a minute. Has anybody had a different experience doing this in a Cessna 172 than I just showed you? Nobody. Well, that's good news. Now, there are some airplanes that have extremely large rudders, where if you put too much rudder in, you probably could just start to enter a spin. But in common trainer airplanes like the 172, you can see how docile stalling in a slip is. But let's explore this a little bit more. If you are slipping, you're typically doing it to get down to the runway, and your nose is going to be below the horizon. So again, a lot of the flying, the way I teach flying is visual. Right? It's all about sight picture and what you see looking outside of the airplane. Notice in that video how high the nose is above the horizon. Would you ever see that if you're slipping down to a runway? No. So in a normal slip, you would have to really, if you're here, you'd have to really haul back on the yoke or stick to get that nose high enough to even get it to stall. And what's the result? Just buffets a little bit, unload and keep going. So let's talk about that unload. I say unload a lot. Some pilots don't know what that means. When you load up the wing, you give it a high angle of attack, usually because you're pulling back on the stick or yoke. Unload simply means release the pressure. So I get that question a lot. Well, because I say in my videos all the time, unload, and I forget not everybody, that word comes from aerobatics quite a bit. We talk about loading and unloading a wing. So it just means release the back pressure, lower the angle of attack. If people are doing slips correctly, they're really not at risk of stalling. But again, it's visual. If you can see the horizon above the nose of the airplane, it is virtually impossible to stall the airplane while you're slipping towards the runway. So it's really not a concern at all. Any questions? All right, let's move on. All right, this is one of my favorites. I like to do a lot of spins. So a spin entry is not a spin. Everyone's familiar with the phases of a spin, the entry, the incipient, the develop phase. Entry and incipient are kind of weird because incipient simply means the beginning of something. Yet, because the people who have engineering degrees and don't do enough flying have to always add extra words and ideas around concepts to make them more complicated, in my mind, you're either entering a spin or you're spinning. If you're spinning, you should use the tried and true pair recovery method. I'm sure I don't have to explain that to everybody here, right? Power off, ailerons, neutral, opposite rudder, elevator, unload. But we have a lot of instructors who don't have a lot of time spinning. And I very often get as students instructors who got their spin endorsement, usually in something that spins really excitingly like a 172. And they do some spins in a super decathlon. They realize they never actually spun an airplane. Because if you've ever tried to spin a 172, it's a hard airplane to actually get into a good spin. More often than not, it's a spiral. And I've been with instructors in 172s. I said, show me how you teach spins. And all they end up in is a spiral. So if you you start a spin, say from a power on stall, that's the most likely scenario where you're going to get into a spin with a student, right? And you're up there holding it, and all of a sudden the nose starts coming off to the left due to all the left yaw propeller tendencies. If all you do, I'm going to demonstrate this in a moment, if all you do is unload, the plane will just fly. You don't do anything else. You could even stay on the rudder if you want to. However, what a lot of instructors will do is think, oh no, we're entering a spin, and they will try to execute a pair recovery. stomp on the right rudder and actually pull the power out and actually induce a right yawing spin. Now you're in a right yawing spin while they thought they were doing pair to recover something that wasn't a spin. Now, I know a lot of people don't do as many spins as I do, but just trust me when I tell you, if you're not in a developed spin, if you simply unload, plane will fly. It's just that simple. So let's look at the video.
I'm going to demonstrate a recovery from an incipient phase of a spin. It's not yet developed. I don't even need to use full pair. I'm just simply going to unload the stick and the spin will stop right away. So get the airplane slowed down and put it in the climb attitude, get the stall to come to me. And right about when I'm ready to stall, I'm going to bring the stick back, rudder in. Now, that's the incipient phase. If I simply unload, look at that. Spin's over. I didn't have to use the full pair recovery because it wasn't a developed spin. It was incipient, and simply by unloading, I made the wing fly again. We got right out.
I found, just my experience, I agree with you, you need power to enter a spin. And that's part of the issue, I think, with teaching spins in a 172 is you have to aggravate the spin to even get it to spin. So to me, a good training airplane doesn't require an aggravated spin to make it spin. I agree with you, it'll do it, but you have to kind of coax it into it. And it's not necessarily, in my opinion, and a lot of people think my opinions suck, it's not a great way to teach spins because I think you should start with the most basic and simple spin entry before you teach things like entering spins in an aggravated mode. I get that that's realistic, but to me, it's hard to building block a lesson around teaching spins if you can never teach the most basic spin entry, which is simply stall the airplane and give it rudder. Base to final. So that is typically a skid, right? Where a slip is one wing down and using top rudder. Top rudder is the rudder closer to the sky. Aerobatic term. I love using the secret words only some of us know. But, right, you're using top rudder to slip. So you have an equilibrium of lift in this direction, yaw in that direction. When it stalls, there's nothing to make it go in either direction. However, the base to final turn's an interesting thing. What happens is people start to turn, realize this is what I've observed. Has anyone ever heard or told a student or a pilot you shouldn't do more than 30 degrees of bank in the pattern? Okay, yeah, a lot of people say that. We can talk about whether you should or shouldn't and why later. However, a lot of pilots have that stuck in their head, that in the pattern, they should not do more than 30 degrees of bank. So the typical setup for the base to final stall spin or stall spiral entry is there's a crosswind usually coming from the same side you're turning. So if it's a left turn, there's a crosswind from your left. So, and the lower time pilots will start the turn, realize they're going to overshoot. They hit the bank limit, right? I cannot bank more than 30 degrees. What am I going to do? Well, I'll just kick that nose over. So when you kick the nose over, and I actually have a lot of videos on my YouTube channel showing this in a plane like a decathlon, how you can just easily encourage the airplane into this kind of, from a skid into a spin. So they're looking over the nose, they're turning, they realize they're still getting blown away. They kick in some rudder and start yawing the nose towards the runway. Visually, that makes it look like the nose drops towards the ground. What do? Nose is dropping, I better pick up the nose. So now what are you doing? You're starting to feed in all the elements of a spin entry. You've got a loaded up wing. You've got yaw in the direction of the turn, right? And you're already slow. Most pilots forget that the more you bank, the higher the load it takes to the higher the right. It's easier to stall. You're closer to the critical angle of attack. And depending on how far they push the situation, they may suddenly find themselves simply departing. Now, Cessnas and decathlons and even extras in pits don't snap into these maneuvers. What they do is when they start to stall, the nose just starts to fall more. It's kind of a gentle, gradual thing. And as that happens, the more it falls towards the ground, the more they want to pick it up with the yoke or stick. And what are they doing? They're simply driving it into the high angle of attack further, and the plane just degrades, not into a spin, typically into a spiral. what we really need to teach people how to do is unload. When I teach unusual attitude training, what I tell people is, by the end of this program, at least what you're going to show me in the airplane is, you're going to be spring loaded to unload. This startle and snatching back, and around the school I teach, we actually call it the startle snatch response. We need to unlearn that from you. I don't even know where you learned it, because to me, it's not natural, right? It's natural to always want to unload and make the airplane fly. And again, we all have different, come from different places of experience and training. But if we taught people to be spring loaded to unload, most accidents would be prevented before they even develop. So anyway, good conversation. Anyway, let's move on. All right, next one might be controversial. I'm a fan of teaching people to, in a crosswind, to slip all the way to touchdown and land on the upwind main and maintain control. The crab and kick method, look, you can go sit at any airport where there's a lot of training activity. You can watch people in a crosswind come in all day long and crab like this and try to kick it straight, right? And when you're learning how to fly, you don't know your plane well enough. You don't know yourself well enough. It's so easy to overshoot the kick or under kick and land with a side load, bounce the airplane, and it's really just not a great technique to teach, in my opinion. I like to teach people in a slip, you can completely control the airplane. You can modulate all the flight. I'm going to show a video in a minute. Modulate the flight controls and control it very easily. You need more aileron, more rudder, whatever you need, and control it very easily and have a very nice, as long as you make sure the nose is pointed straight down the runway with the right amount of rudder pressure, land it straight. It's so much easier. And it builds confidence in crosswind landing technique, because the crab and kick straight method, I don't think builds confidence in people. It's more scary because they kind of never know how it's going to turn out. Yes. No difference. In fact, in a tailwheel airplane, so Mark was he knows where I'm going. Mark was talking about wheel landings. I'm a big fan of wheel landings. I do them. I used to do my pits all the time, even though people say you can't wheel land a pits. I'll argue that one all day long. But in a tailwheel airplane, if you do a wheel landing, I find in most tailwheel airplanes in a heavy crosswind, you have much more control. I'll land on one wheel, right? Tail up, wheel landing, upwind main, and let the other one come down. And then it's, as I push forward to stick those mains on, very controlled. I've landed my pits in probably up to 40 knots crosswind at air show, where like you're in an air show, I got to go fly. I've flown with like 40 to 50 knots of on-crowd wind and then had to land in that. And I'm still here talking to you, and I haven't broken any airplanes doing that. I've broken them doing other stuff, but not that. All right. So let's look at the video.
All right, as we line up with final for runway 13, the wind is 140 at 15, gusting 18. So there's a good crosswind. And a good crosswind calls for a slipping approach with the slip held all the way to the runway and land on the upwind main wheel. I'm going to start off with a little bit of crab to stay lined up with the runway. Don't need to slip yet. Slow the airplane down, get in first notch of flaps. I'm a little high on the approach. I'm going to put the slip in. Wind's coming from the right, so I'm going to put the right wing down, put in left rudder. I'm going to start off with full left rudder and as much wing down as I feel I need to hold center line. Probably need a little less rudder, a little less wing down. I'm just modulating it to hold center line. I'm going to take the slip out for now. It seems like my sink rate is adequate. I feel like I can make the runway safely. All right, a little bit of slip back in. Bit of left rudder, a little bit of right wing down into the upwind. Power all the way out. Second notch of flaps in. I'm not going to go full flaps. And in a crosswind, we take our time. So I got full left rudder and just as much right aileron as I need. And I'm going to hold it off the runway as long as I can, landing on the upwind main. I got the runway made. Take your time in the crosswind. Get that nose up on the upwind main, other main, nose down. We got it. That's how you do a crosswind slip to landing.
So every time you slip with full flaps, you crash into the ground. Okay. I'll just tell you what my experience is doing it. And again, if someone has a different experience, I've never crashed doing it, I promise you. Oh, I wouldn't. Okay. So what happens is, you're right. When the flaps are down and you slip, you blanket the tail. That starts to set up an oscillation in the airplane, right? As the tail moves in and out of that airflow. If you go do this at altitude, and I would encourage you to go take a Cessna 172 up, put the flaps down. And if you have access to one that can do 40 degrees of flaps, go try it. Go at altitude and try it. What happens is it oscillates like this. However, once you do that for a little bit, you realize that oscillation is very understandable. And then you realize why it doesn't say it's prohibited or it just says avoid. So because it's not prohibited, oh, please.
I was just going to add to what you're saying. I think you're going there right there. It's not in the limitations section of the aircraft. If it were dangerous, it would be in the limitations section. And subsequently, later models of 172s, they've removed that altogether.
Right. So if you know what happens when you do it and you realize the plane is simply going to oscillate, then you know what to expect when you do it. And I'm going to talk, and another one of my topics here is going to be all about knowing how the airplane performs and how you perform as a pilot. But it is not actually prohibited. They're making you aware of what can happen when you do it. All right. So let's talk about the turning slip from down. So one of the maneuvers you have to teach, and they may get asked to show on a check ride, is the 180 power off landing as an emergency procedure. I've had a few emergency landings, including one where I had no prop on my airplane in my pits and landed. And I promise you, I did not get 100 in the pattern, 180 degrees of beam the numbers. I already had no power, and then do this really cool maneuver to the numbers. So it's a great maneuver when you have to teach it. I like to teach it that as soon as you roll into the bank to turn, it's a slip. Create a slip right there. You can very easily control the airplane down to the runway. And even if the wind's coming from the other direction, by the time you roll out on final, you flip the slip over to the other side while you're still several hundred feet up and do it. So anyway, let's take a look at this, and then everyone can throw rocks at me after.
St. Augustine Tower, Cessna 600 Bravo Charlie, downwind to beam for the option.
River 9 Bravo Charlie, runway 31, cleared to land. We're going to do a runway change. We'll taxi you back.
Clear to land, runway 31, 69 Bravo Charlie. Maybe I'll just make this the last one then.
River 9 Bravo Charlie, roger. Wind 080 at 6.
So the wind has moved around to 080, so it's really going to be off from the right side. Really good chance to work on the crosswind approach. Okay, as I'm at turn, I've got full flaps in. I'm going to come in with top rudder.
Wind 080 at 7.
And just let the slip do its job. Turning towards the runway, in a slip, in a turning slip. I've got top rudder. I've got the right wing down. And I'm just tracking center line.
Helicopter 32 Alpha Kilo, proceed as requested.
Even with the crosswind, I'm tracking center line by using the slip. I'm going to hold the slip all the way to the runway, land on the upwind main only. Take your time in a crosswind.
Okay, throw the rocks. This is how I like to show people how to do, in a cross. This is in a cross, not really a 180 power off turn, but the technique is the same. You can turn the airplane in a slip. And sometimes when you talk to people about turning in a slip, they look at me like I'm crazy for, any number of reasons, but for saying something like that. All right, the last subject I'm going to talk about, probably the most controversial thing in aviation. People get their feelings hurt in internet forums all the time over this subject. Amazing. The impossible turn. So before I show the video, and actually the video I'm not going to show any flying other than me talking about an airplane. So I did this for Sporties. This was part of a series. And they said, well, how are you going to present this? And in my mind, it really should never have been called the impossible turn. It's really the improbable turn, because some people have actually done it. And they've done it for two reasons. One is luck. I don't think we have to explain what luck is. And the other is they've gone out and practiced it at altitude. They've learned about how the airplane performs with no engine, especially in turning flight. They understood how they perform as a pilot, and they were able to apply that in an engine out. Now, there's a ton of variables to this. How high are you when the engine quits? Right? What is going to be your minimum, maximum altitude to try it if the engine quits? And I'm going to remind you, I'm going to say it in the video. In the Cessna emergency checklist, number 8 says, if you lose power after takeoff, land straight ahead. So let's just start with that. The checklist says don't do it, but everybody's kind of rationalized how they can do it. So let me, because I got a ton of hate mail from people like, how could Sporties put this on their YouTube page? And who's this Spencer guy? And, you know, arrest him. So let's look at that first. And this is a great way to end the discussion, because I think we can all discuss this. Really, my goal is to help pilots and student pilots learn how to win arguments in internet forums over the impossible turn. My only goal.
One of the most important emergencies you can plan for and train for is an engine failure right after takeoff. Well, let's see what the checklist says. The checklist has many items on it, but number 8 is the one we're going to talk about right now. Number 8 says land straight ahead. So if the checklist says land straight ahead, why do some pilots think they can turn back towards the runway and attempt to land on the runway they just took off from? Some pilots call this the impossible turn, but really it's the unlikely turn or the improbable turn, because so many pilots have rationalized that they can actually turn back towards the airport and land on the runway they just took off from, that I don't even know why we call it the impossible turn anymore. While it's unlikely you'll make it, especially if you're low to the ground and close to the airport, and many pilots have proven over and over again that you can't make it, it's a misconstrued emergency procedure. What are the factors at play here that prevent so many pilots from achieving the impossible turn? You have to consider the aerodynamics of the airplane. When you've lost power and you've established best glide and you start turning and banking the airplane, the more you bank, the more the airplane's going to sink. Without power, the airplane cannot hold altitude. And if you try to hold altitude, you're most definitely going to have a stall situation, which you don't want in an engine out when you're trying to head back for the airport. The other thing to consider is, how proficient are you as a pilot? And this is probably the most important concern. How proficient are you as a pilot to maneuver the airplane in such a way that you can make the impossible turn or the improbable turn back to the airport? How often do you go out and practice this? How well do you know yourself? How well do you know the airplane and its performance capabilities? I'm not here to tell you how to do the impossible turn. I'm going to show you how to evaluate your airplane's performance and your performance and capability as a pilot to even think about attempting it. And by the way, in an emergency, that's the last time you want to try something that you have never practiced before. In emergencies, we execute the maneuvers we've already practiced and have demonstrated proficiency in. So if a checklist says you should land straight ahead, why would you decide at the last moment that you can turn back towards the airport, especially if you haven't practiced it and don't know the parameters of the airplane, and if it's even possible?
So the number one piece of nasty feedback I got from several people on that video is, good job keeping your head on a swivel looking for traffic outside the airplane. All right. Oh, yeah.
So you said the Cessna manual says if you lose an engine on takeoff, continue straight ahead and land straight ahead, or whatever it says. At what point are you no longer on takeoff? It's a rhetorical question.
I have no idea.
But at some point, you're not, right? Yeah.
Right.
But, so I agree with you.
Okay. So actually, that's a great question. At what point are you no longer on? Thanks for queuing me up. At what point are you no longer on takeoff? I don't know. I don't know if anyone can really answer that question. In my mind, you're taking off until you're leveled off, or you're so far from the airport and high enough that it's pretty clear you could probably safely turn around and glide. My point in teaching, and in the video that I did, I actually go and show people what happens when you pull the power and I did bank angles of different, varying bank angles to show sink rates. And at 45 degrees of bank with no power, if you don't try to hold altitude, you can get up into, 1,100 foot per minute sink rates. And everyone should go up and try it. So when someone says, well, impossible turn, my first question is, when was the last time you went up and tried it in an airplane to understand how it performs? So let me ask, right? That's my first question. Second question, you take off from a runway, you lose your engine. Are you going to make your first turn to the right or the left? And that's when they just get a blank stare, right? It's dependent on the wind. Turn into the wind. If you turn downwind, if you turn away from the wind, you're going to get blown so far away from the airport, you're never getting back. And you're going to have to somehow get if you just do a 180 turn, you're going to, you're probably going to land in the parking lot by the restaurant. So somehow you've got to do some form of 90 to 70 or, pick your numbers. But you have to go out and try it, at a safe altitude and just understand how an airplane performs and what altitude would you even try to turn back? So kind of to your point, right? How high do you have, what's the minimum or maximum where you might be able to do it? If you have a really high performance airplane that climbs really fast, you might not be able to get back down to the airport and you might still be relatively close. So the last emergency I had was when my prop came off my airplane and I headed towards an airport that was 2 miles away. I didn't head for the airport. I headed a mile off the runway. I knew what kind of speed I had. I knew my airplane. And there's a story in AOPA with my actual flight track about this. Just look up Spencer Suderman lands his propless pits. If you look at the flight path, I went a mile off the end of the runway. I spiraled down until I felt I could make it, rolled out of that, headed for the end of the runway, slipped it, and got it to land. I was off. It's a 4,000-foot runway at Whiteman Airport in Los Angeles. I was off. I almost rolled off at the intersection in the middle in front of the tower. I had to get out and push. So anyway, okay, so let me ask a question. My favorite things to do to pilots. On climb out, I'll wait till we're at a safe altitude, not low. We're climbing out, right? We're at whatever speed, we're 80, 75, whatever. I like to quickly pull the power off the airplane. What should you do if the power suddenly, you're in a climb out? What should be your immediate response when you lose power? Don't all answer at once. Right, push the nose down, right? We all know that. We're sitting here, we can think about it. We all know what we expect the student or the pilot to do. How many times have you ever just pulled the power out and watched them sit there with the nose up, wondering what to do next? I've seen that a bunch. Mid to high, remember, I typically fly with mid to high time pilots. I've just pulled the power out, and I do it kind of aggressively because I'm kind of a jerk. But I just go, and they usually, I literally saw one guy try to jump out of it. He was like, "What just happened?" You tell me what just happened. Like, is it quieter in here now? That's your first clue. Anyway, but the first thing you got to get people to do is get the nose down. To your point, VX, VY. In an emergency, it's a little hard to get people to think that technically. They should get the nose down and look for best glide speed, whatever's called for, 55, 75, 80, whatever airplane you're in. I think my time is up. I'm not that hard to find online. If anybody wants to send me hate mail, that's fine. Thank you all very much for your time today.